Neil D. Brown, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, yeah, good. Do you know it's been a little more than a year? It's hard to believe since we discussed your book, Ending the Parent-Teen Control Battle.
That's right.
And it seems like it was yesterday to me. So I'm surprised that a whole year has gone by. And I understand you've been doing a series of workshops since then on parental burnout. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been mostly working with professionals and
professional
psychotherapists.
Okay.
In the Ending the Parent-Teen Control Battle model.
Yeah.
And I'm about to start working with some residential treatment centers and helping them with their model with families, working with families to understand the control battle model. And I will be launching some trainings to work with parents as well. That's coming up in the next few months.
Okay. So why parental burnout? How is it that you've sort of migrated in that direction?
Well, that's an important question. It is in the book that one of the negative outcomes of parent-teen control battles is parental burnout. And that's a fact. It's something that I've become aware of throughout my years of working with families, that by the time they come into counseling, parents are fatigued, they have a sense of hopelessness, they're experiencing a lot of futility, their parental self-esteem has fallen dramatically, they're feeling like they're bad parents, they've lost faith in their kid, they've lost faith in the process, they may have even gotten some counseling previously only to have a low outcome or a negative outcome. And by the time they're in counseling, they come to counseling, they're experiencing burnout. So when I started doing blogs and podcasting on the subject, suddenly the boards lit up. And that was where, I could talk about a lot of subjects, but once I was talking about parental burnout, suddenly the response rate shot through the roof. So I realized that this was a theme that's really resonating with parents and something that needed to be talked about and addressed even more.
Wow. I understand based on your explanation. My first take when you mentioned it to me, parental burnout, it was hard for me to relate to it because, knock on wood, the parenting of our 4 kids went relatively smoothly. And so that's why it was hard for me to relate to burnout. I never felt like I was burning out on being a parent, but I could see that in some of these really conflictual child-parent relationships, parents could, in fact, really come to that point saying, hey, I've had it. That's why they go to therapy, right? That's why they seek out therapy. It's like, we're going nuts here. We don't know what to do. So, yeah, I can see that your boards lit up as you spoke, as you mentioned.
David, you might be the exception. I think a lot of parents would say at times, all parents would say, or most parents would say, oh, I've gotten burned out, or I'm burned out, particularly parents of young kids when they're on 24/7 and never have any downtime. Then the primary parent with a lack of support or just being on all the time, particularly if you got a kid who's either not sleeping or is sick, they'll go through periods of burnout. But when I'm talking about burnout, I'm talking about something that's more than the expression that we would use on a daily basis is what's going on. In other words, we would all maybe on a Friday say, oh, I'm so burnt out. Or at the end of a really tough day, say, oh man, I'm burnt. And we all kind of take that with a grain of salt and move on from it. But what I'm talking about is something that's a lot more profound than that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, sometimes life looks rosier in the rearview mirror as you're looking back, and you kind of forget some of the difficulties. So maybe there were times, I know with one of our kids in particular, there was a rough patch that we went through. But
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm, mhm.
um, I would think that it would be particularly likely and acute in single parent configurations, say where the husband has disappeared and the mother's like carrying it all by herself. Do you find that to be the case?
In many cases, yes. I think single parenting is very, very challenging in as much as you don't have someone to say, hey, take over, I gotta go, or I need a
Yeah,
break, I need you to take over.
yeah,
That it's really hard when you don't have that in place. And I think it's also uh, challenging and common for single parents to have blur boundaries a little bit more with their kids. In other words, they don't have an adult to talk to as much, and so they're likely to look to get more of their emotional needs met, and to
good
maybe
point.
speak more personally with their kids. And then that makes it harder for them to be in the limit setting parent role. And then when the kids don't accept limits, then that becomes an exhausting process for the single parent to try to get a kid to cooperate and manage their responsibilities.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I can also imagine scenarios where, for example, the somewhat distant husband or the husband who is so engaged with work that it feels to his spouse like he's not there for the parenting, or the kid is he has no problems. He says, well, I don't see any of this stuff. The kid's
Mhm.
always good with me.
Mhm.
And
Right,
because there's sort of in a honeymoon type relationship where he's not around
right.
that much. Or it
Well,
could be,
some
it could be, the genders could be reversed in what I'm
yes,
saying.
that's true too. I think what you're saying is very true, that for parents that don't get the support they need from their spouse, from the other parent, that can lead to a high level of frustration and a sense of yeah, just that lack of support and expectation that someone's supposed to be there and they're not. And that can be very frustrating. And then, of course, there's the issue of when parents aren't aligned and one parent is undermining another parent in one way or another. So the child is now triangulated in a certain way. And now, when a parent is trying to accomplish something, then they're getting undermined by the other parent. And so that's worse than single parenting, because now the other parent is actually, you're being undermined by the other parent, not usually intentionally. It's usually two parents that just are approaching things very differently and haven't been able to align their work, or they're acting out some sort of issue that exists in their relationship.
Yeah. What about other sorts of configurations? For example, both parents are working.
Hmm.
Is that, what does that add to the mix?
Well, I think if there's no one at home and there are challenges at home, and and so parents feel like they can never get on top of it at home, and then when they go to work, now the phone's ringing and they're getting called by the school, and my kid's sick or my kid is acting out, and then then parents are going to always feel like they're never going to be successful. And I think that's one of the contributing factors of burnout, is a sense that I can never be successful. And
Hmm.
so when parents aren't there and don't have their don't have a good parenting strategy in place, that will lead to burnout for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. And what about shared custody situations? I could imagine that would have its own stresses and strains.
It does, and because then you don't have control, and so you're trying to. Here's something I see quite frequently: is a parent's trying to teach a kid some limits and instill some values and some ways of being in the world, and then the other parents undermining all that and giving them a free rein and won't hold them accountable. And so now there's this, and that's another way to feel undermined and frustrated. And once again, when you're putting a lot of effort into something and your efforts are ending up going no place, think about it at any job. If you went to work and your efforts were undermined and you care very deeply about your work and you're trying very hard, and yet no matter what you do, the project always got undermined and unappreciated and unsupported, you'd burn out. So that is a formula for burnout.
Yeah. I mentioned gender earlier. I don't know. Have you had experience working with same gender parents?
Yes, sure. And
I imagine they suffer from the same same issues and problems as as traditional marriages.
well, here's something I think is true, and that is that women, I find, whether they're in same-sex relationships or heterosexual relationships, women burn out more frequently than men. And
Hmm.
the reason I think that happens is women are much more other person oriented. They tend to think about the needs of others more than men do. So men will, when the going gets rough, they'll go play golf.
Okay.
If To stereotype a little bit. In other words, and obviously it's not going to be golf, but I think men are much more selfish. And I think we as a gender are willing to pull the plug and say, you know what, I'm had enough of this. I'm going to go take care of myself.
Hmm.
And you're going to go have to figure this one out on your own. And I think
Yeah.
I think moms are much more reluctant to say, go figure it out. I think they'll hold the burden of their children's happiness much more strongly than men will.
Now, you're not just talking through your head about this stuff, right? Because I seem to recall that you're a parent. I know you have at least a son who's I think, a neuroscientist,
He's a neuropsychologist, yeah.
neuropsychologist. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Uh, was that your only kid, or?
No, we have two children. I have another son.
Mhm.
He went to Portland State University. He got his degree in art, and he does art and music. And lately, he's been a tutor in the Portland public school system. And I think he's still trying to figure out where he wants to land in terms of a career. But yeah, he's figuring it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm sure it's good to be on the other side of it now, of the whole raising, rearing process.
Mm-hmm.
Were you and or your wife ever at that point of burnout that you're talking about? Do you recall?
Uh, no, I don't think we were. I mean, I think that we both would feel very much like I think most parents feel at certain times, like, oh my God, I'm burnt out. But then we'd get our needs met and we'd get the support of the other parent, and we'd be okay. So, and my wife and I were aligned in our parenting. In other words, I always did what she asked.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
right. So, I mean, we all get tired. Parenting is a very challenging job. You have to prioritize your children's needs over your own. And that
Yeah.
has to be there. That's going to be there. And you make that choice when you choose to have kids, and that's the way it goes. But if so we're up for that. It feels good. We were the right age to do it, and we were the right mindset to do it. And yeah, it was tiring and it was exhausting. And sometimes we really longed for time together or time for ourselves. But we didn't burn out because we had each other and we had some friends and we had support and we had activities. My wife's a long distance runner. So she always had that for herself.
But you always had to come back.
She always had to come back. Maybe that's why she was a marathoner.
She could run a long ways away, but then she'd have to come back.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
But she would
yeah,
come back refreshed.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that parenting is a demanding job, and I think many of us have the perception, the sense that it's gotten to be a harder job, particularly with the advent of all of this technology. What's your take on all of that? Do you think it's harder to be a parent now than it used to be?
I think there are definitely some new and different challenges that are going on now that can make parenting more difficult. Uh, and technology, well, technology is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we can text and keep in touch, and if you're worried about your kid, you can text or call and know where they are. You could find my phone and know where they are at any given moment. And on the other hand, getting ourselves off our phones so that we're paying attention to each other and paying attention to our kids and having quality time and getting our kids off their devices so that they have quality time with us. I think being a family is a harder thing right now because I think we're all have the next member of the family is our technology, and that's a very demanding member of the family. And I think
Mm.
it's a huge distraction from real relationships and from human connection. And I think parents are suffering from that in their own lives. I think couples are suffering from that, and I think kids and parent relationships are suffering from that, and I think kid-peer relationships are suffering from that as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess you see all of these things in your practice.
Absolutely, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
and
see it at the park when I go to the park, and I'm going for my own little jog, and I go to this one park where I like to do some pull-ups and work out on the kids' playground material, and I'll go and do my exercises on it. And there'll be a kid on the climbing bars going, "Mommy, mommy, look at me!" And mommy will look up from her phone and go, "Oh, that's nice," and then go back, and there she is texting again,
yeah,
and they're just not as engaged. Parents just are not as engaged as they used to be. And I don't want to speak for everybody because there's lots of parents that are doing a fabulous job out there. But I think we're all suffering from the allure of our phones.
yeah. So, what's the remedy? What are these burnt out parents to do about this?
Mhm. Well, I think that's a good, a very important question. With respect to technology, just that little piece, David, I think it's very important to start kids early on understanding the protocols, the positives and the negatives, and how to use technology and how to put it away. I think that's very important. Just like you're going to teach kids how to behave socially and how to manage time and how to manage feelings and how to make choices, how to treat other kids. They're going to have to learn how to use technology. So parents should very early on make sure that as they introduce it, that they make sure that they understand that there's rules and limits, just like there is with anything else in their lives. There's limits on sweets. There's limits on technology, and make sure parents have passwords. They get kids on these apps and these games, and then they get them off. And kids learn that there are limits very early on, and that's practiced in the household. There should be evenings that parents have with their kids that are game night or reading night or project night, nights that we put all our technology away and I'm done at the office and I'm not going to answer my texts and emails anymore. And I'm not going to work on this late night project, and we're all just going to be connected and we're going to be a family together. So I think
So the
that's one
parents,
thing.
yeah, the parents have to kind of take the lead and model that as well, right?
Absolutely. We got to put our stuff away and relate to each other. You can't be saying one thing and doing another.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
Can't be
Now,
falling down.
technology, yeah,
You can't be falling down drunk and telling your kids not to drink.
right.
Right.
So technology aside, what is the cure for parental burnout?
Okay. Well, there's a few of them. Number one is get support. If you're working in any job and you're not getting that positive feedback, someone that says, "I know what you're doing and I see what you're doing and you're doing great," or "That was really hard, but I like how you did it," or "That was really hard, but I'm proud of you because you did it," Someone has to be there, witness what you do, and give you feedback. We need to get our emotional needs met. Some of that feedback can be honest, constructive criticism. In other words, hey, have you thought about this? Or maybe what's going on with your kid is they're hungry, or maybe what's going on with your kid is they just need more attention, or maybe what's going on with your kid is, or maybe you could set a limit this way and that might be easier. So those are all good things. We need to get that constructive feedback, that perspective, but you're only going to accept feedback and perspective from someone that also gives you support. So you need someone or someones in your life that will give you that support. And that's a critical thing. If you don't have a spouse, then you should get it. You need to get it from someone that knows what they're talking about. It needs to be someone that you respect as a parent. Maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a brother or a sister, or a brother-in-law or a sister-in-law, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a parenting group, but we're
Hmm.
going to need to have that. We're going to need to have that feedback with someone that you respect, and that's essentially positive. We're going to need that. That's number one.
So I imagine that in the therapy that you do with couples, that part of it is sort of training them, giving them practice in offering that kind of support.
Yes, and sometimes they get it from me, but we
Uh-huh.
want it to be sustainable. We don't want the therapy to be that one source of support. We want to make sure that it's happening in their lives together. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So that's one thing. The other thing is we all need some downtime. We all need me time.
Mm.
Parents need a break. If all work and no play makes Johnny a dull boy, I mean, we are going to burn out. If you're going to the office and you go home and you go to sleep and you get back up and you go to the office, and you eat pizza and then you crash and wake up and you go back to the office, well, that's a formula for burnout. You need to go for that run. You need to go for that walk. You need to be able to go out with your friends and have and talk about stupid stuff. You need to go pick up your watercolors and paint, and pick up a novel and read, or just go out into the downtown and sit in a coffee shop and watch, and people watch. We need these breaks in our lives so that you just feel like a person again. You're not always a parent. You've got to feel like a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you have to get out of your role and do something that relates to you, that's personal and relevant and fulfilling.
Yeah. This also makes me think in a little bit different direction that family vacations might be important too, where you're taking a break as a family.
changing Changing the environment is always a great thing to do. So parents that use their community resources will go to the library, will go to the
Mm.
park, will go to the music fest. Those are good to do. The other thing, pick up and go to the lake in the summertime and spend a few days there, even if you have to camp out. Something. Sometimes it seems like too much work to go put all that together, but
Or too much expense,
or
but
too much
it doesn't
expense.
it doesn't have to be a real expensive trip to Europe or something.
No, it doesn't have to be Disneyland, which will chew up your credit card and spit it out before you know it. It
Yeah.
can be something. It can be something. I mean, I think sitting down and talking to the kids, and depending on the ages of the kids, and what would be fun, and create an outing, plan an outing, and then go do it. I mean, my wife would do really creative things, like she'd just go to the woods and they'd berry pick, and then they'd come back and they'd make a pie out of the berries. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Doing
Yeah. Yeah.
projects and things with young kids is a great thing to do. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Are there certain ages of children that are especially difficult and likely to lead to burnout?
The kind of burnout that you get at different ages is is different. In other words,
Okay.
when kids are very young, and they're breastfeeding, for instance, and they're infants, well, the risk there is that mom's going to be on 24/7. She's going to be up all night doing the feeding. She's going to be up in the morning doing the feeding. She's going to be in the afternoon doing the feeding. And at some point, mom's going to feel like she's nothing more than a feeding and comforting machine, and she's going to forget that she's a person. And that can lead to that kind of burnout.
Okay.
And then there's the burnout that parents of toddlers can get, where they're just chasing the little rugrats around all the time and trying to keep them out of harm's way and trying to keep the other functions in the family going. And at some point, it's just so much hands-on work that they can burn out from that and not getting a break from that. At the end of the day, that can be exhausting. So they'll need some really breaks in that structure. They'll need some support. They'll need someone to tag off to and be in charge. And then as kids get older, one of the challenges is what my book is about, is the control battle. So when parents and kids or teens get into a pattern of interaction which is counterproductive, so what happens is the pattern itself becomes self-reinforcing and develops its own momentum. So kids resisting parental guidance and cooperation, they're actively being uncooperative, and parents are working really hard to get their kids to cooperate, to either do or not do certain behaviors. And then kids are resisting and avoiding those certain responsibilities or behaviors. Now all the energy that a parent is putting in is actually being turned back in terms of resistance to them. So that repetitive pattern of constantly trying to accomplish something that's constantly turned back is exhausting. Any improvements that parents get will be short-lived. Things that should be relatively easy, like, hey, turn off the computer and get going on your homework, can be a battle that just is absolutely fatiguing. And then if they can get it to happen, and once they get it to happen, then the quality of the homework that the kid is doing is poor, and they're resentful. And so you can get into these patterns, which at that point, parenting just feels hopeless, and a parent feels helpless and like they can't accomplish anything. And that's going to lead to depression and fatigue and hopelessness and low parental self-esteem.
Yeah. I can imagine that you're a very good therapist for couples because you are so empathic in your understanding of these dilemmas.
Oh,
As I hear you discuss it, it's like I can tell that you really understand it, that you know what those problems and issues are. And that must be reassuring to the people that consult you, to say, okay, this guy knows what I'm going through.
yeah, I think that's really important when you're seeing a therapist, that therapist really gets your pain point. Number
Mhm.
one, and then number two, has some idea about what can be done about it. So if
Yeah.
they just get the pain point, but now does nothing but empathize, that's not going to help a lot. And then if they're all ready to roll up their sleeves and say, hey, let's start changing things, but they don't really quite get what you're feeling and why you are where you are, then they're not going to follow either. So it is important for a therapist to have both of those offerings for their clients.
Yeah. Coming back to what can be done about it, you were taking us through some of what can be done about it. Is there anything more that you would want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think with respect to, let's just take a look at that pattern. I think it's really important for parents when they're in a control battle to understand that the control battle is its own thing. And David, this is actually what I think makes me the most effective in my work as a therapist, is I can see, I've, since I'm such a die-in-the-wool family therapist, I've come to understand, I've been looking at patterns now for 40 years, and I've come to understand and have a deep and profound respect for the power of the pattern. So it's not that the parent's a bad parent, and it's not that the kid's a bad kid, or that the couple, the spouses are bad spouses, it's that the pattern has now taken over, and the pattern has a power and a momentum all its own that it's controlling the members of the family. So when I can help families and parents and kids even understand these patterns and begin to fight the pattern instead of each other, then I can get some progress and I can help people be much more effective with each other.
How do you get them to fight the pattern?
Well, I think one is understand that the pattern is an entity, and now it's an entity in their family, much like
Hmm.
technology is now an entity in their family. Well, the
Yeah.
pattern, I call it the beast. In my book, I call it the beast.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
the challenge is, and I kind of make a sport out of it, starve the beast. And so what are the behaviors that feed the beast, and what are the behaviors that can starve the beast? And then I
Hmm.
invite all the family members to understand their own beast feeding behaviors and to come to awareness about what beast starving behaviors are and get them to use those skill sets. So changing the pattern is what we want to do, not changing the other person, but changing the pattern. Realizing that kids can get more of what they want when they're not in a control battle with their parents, and parents can get more of what they want from their kids when they're not in a control battle with their kids. So rather than trying to get the other one to change and give me what I want, change their relationship with the control battle, and that's the better way to get what they want. So
Hmm.
that's the theme that I utilize there.
Yeah. And do you meet just with the parents, or do you meet with the whole family, or sometimes one and sometimes the other? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I'll virtually always start with the whole family, because that
Uh-huh.
way I can like, until I understand the dynamic and still I understand what that beast looks like and how it behaves and how they feed it, then talking to parents and kids so much is a lot of assumption, and not that I can't make reasonable assumptions at times, but I'd love to, if I have the opportunity to have everyone in the room at the same time, that's a best option. So I can really get that.
Uh-huh.
And then,
And you go ahead. Yeah.
well, then from there, I can I can develop in harmony with the family. I can collaborate and we can come up with a treatment plan that's going to be ideal for the family, which could involve some individual work with the kids, some individual work with parents, or working with the whole group, or combinations of that.
So how quick are kids to latch on to the concept of the beast and kind of recognize that and get involved with that?
Um, that's a very individual question. I mean, I think it's often a matter of flexibility, and kids and parents who are more flexible and looking for a solution are more amenable to understanding my metaphor and my opportunities. And those that are more entrenched, I have to roll up my sleeves, be a little more patient, uh, find out more about what's holding them back, and help take more time and be more patient and work harder to get them to realize their opportunities and how they're self-sabotaging.
Yeah.
It does require a lot of empathy for what they're experiencing, but also a resolute vision of what health can look like for them, and helping families choose health, helping kids choose health, and helping parents choose health. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
wonder if you have any case examples that you could give us that to illustrate some of the things that you've been talking about.
Sure. Um, I could give you a couple of different examples of different kinds of burnout. One family, I would say, it's a family that's in the high tech world. Uh, Suddenly they came into a bunch of money because of their company doing well, and so there's a payout. And now I've got this engineer who decides that he's going to buy his home in paradise for his family. So they buy this beautiful home in the mountains, and he commutes every day to go to work. And now his wife and her ADHD child and her newborn child are there stuck in the mountains without a neighborhood, without any support. The husband
Mm.
thinks it's paradise, so what's your problem? You know, I've bought you this beautiful place in paradise. I've given you these two beautiful kids. You have all the money in the world. I don't know why you should have any problems. And there's mom, sad. She's uh, English is her second language, so it's not easy for her to connect through the school and make friends. She's a little culturally dystonic or different from the mainstream parents, so she doesn't know quite how to relate, and she's starting with a level of depression. So as a depressed person, now how is
Wow.
she going to connect and say, hey, let's go to coffee together, or let's have play dates, because she doesn't feel worthy anymore. So this became a situation where mom was extremely depressed. Her parenting of her ADHD kid, which was wearing her out, got worse and worse. And dad was critical, because after all, I had given you all these wonderful gifts and all you can do is criticize me for it. So that became a real horrible situation of burnout, and I could not maintain them in the counseling environment. I couldn't keep them engaged. So that was
Mm.
not a good therapeutic outcome.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate that example because it grounds it
Hmm.
what we've been talking about in the challenges of the real world,
Hmm.
where you've got the ADHD kid and you've got the mother from another culture and who has depression, and so I guess uh, in particularly difficult parental burnout situations, there are those sorts of issues that they're coping, not just in the abstract, but with physical difficulties, mental health difficulties,
Hmm.
cultural difficulties.
Hmm.
Yeah, a great example. Do you have another one for us?
Sure. So that was a family with young kids with a lot of social isolation. I have another family, which gratefully is having a much better outcome. It's a family that had been to several marriage counselors, several therapists for the identified patient uh, teenager, and they were getting no place. And the mother's individual therapist referred them to me, and I saw a very triangulated family. So when the boy was with his father, he did reasonably well. But when the mom was involved, then mother and son were in a coalition, and the boy would resist his father's limits, and mother and dad would get harsh because he was upset about that. So he'd get angry at his son, and then he'd get angry at his wife for supporting their son. And mother could only see dad as an angry, hostile parent, and dad could only see mom as an enabling, enmeshed parent. And son just ran the seam, and so he wasn't doing his work. And now, yes, he did have some learning issues, so he did need tutoring and support, but he wasn't investing in any of that. He was just skating and watching everyone else do all the work. And when they came to me, they were all burnt out. Parents were on the verge of divorce. Kid was not doing well. Uh, he was on his computer endlessly, was socially isolated except with the friends that he had on his gaming friends. He was doing very poorly in school, very poorly socially. He had his own kind of, I'd say, burnout, but I'd just call it adolescent depression and underfunctioning. And dad was burnt out, mom was burnt out, and they were so at odds with each other. This was a family that was just struggling and undermining themselves because of what I'll say is the presence of the beast. So this pattern had gotten so profound that everyone was owned by the pattern. There was, among the three of them, there was there was no one left who had any mental health left in the family. They were all on burnout. So my challenge was to get them to understand the presence of the beast and help them understand how they're each feeding the beast. And it took me, David, this was a very challenging family. It's taken me
Sounds like it.
yeah, it took me about, I would say, 6 to 8 months to really break this pattern. But the family is breaking the pattern. The boy he lost his computer privileges only because we helped engineer limit setting, healthy limit setting in the family. In other words, healthy limit setting is positive limit setting. It's not a punishment. It's just a way of saying privileges are things that you've got to earn and some other things aren't in place. And so let's get those things in place and then you can have your privileges. Well, this young man lost his computer privileges. But what he gained out of that was a social life. And he started connecting with other kids in other ways other than on his computer. And he started to do better. And I got mom to understand how she's undermining the boy's relationship with his father and the father's relationship with the boy, and to back out. And I was able to help the father see how he fed the beast with his anger and how he could take a much more supportive role both with his son and with his wife. And it took a long time, but I'm seeing some mental health return in this family. I'm seeing a higher functioning kid. I'm seeing a mom who feels better and looks better. I'm seeing a dad who's more relaxed and less consumed with his rage and his sense of outrage and his righteous indignation. He's a lot more humble and relaxed, and everyone in the family is doing a lot better.
Wow, that's another great example. And it really underscores how challenging the role of being a therapist can be. And you certainly don't fit the stereotype of the therapist who is relatively passive and just nodding his head and saying, it sounds like in this kind of work, you need to be very active, very involved.
That is very true. You know, the first couple of years that I was a therapist working at a mental health center, I really didn't have the tools. I knew what I wanted to do, but I had no tools for doing it. And I was listening to my patients, but I had no idea what to do next. So I did a lot of listening and a lot of supporting. And I just thought, you know what? You just chose the wrong profession. That's the problem here. You're just going to have to figure out, now that you got your MSW and you're working, okay, you made a mistake. Maybe you can do administration or something like that. Maybe that'll feel better. But then I started really getting active in my training, getting myself trained up, and I started going to brief therapy trainings, and I went to family therapy trainings left and right. And then eventually I went to the Child Guidance Center in Philadelphia and studied with Salvador Minuchin. I was in his last training class at the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center, and worked for a month there. And then the Child Guidance Center people were coming out to the West Coast and doing trainings. And so I participated in those trainings. And then at the youth service agency that I was working at, eventually I left the mental health center, went to work at youth services. And we put in our own viewing mirror so that we could have supervision, and we would call into the therapist and talk about what's going on. The therapist could leave the room, go back at a consult, go back in, move in another direction. And then it became a very dynamic process. Now it's all about, how do you create change? How do you get outcomes? How do you get results? How do you help a family go from here to there? How do you take dysfunction and make it functional? How do you take mental distress and turn it into mental health? And so with that challenge, yes, it invited a much more strategic, a much more active therapeutic role. And then I became in love with my profession. Then I couldn't get enough of it. And then I became a real family therapy junkie at that point. And I just couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah, that's a great story, because you were skirting therapist burnout, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then through your own initiative of seeking out more training and more supervision and so on, you were really able to turn that totally around and get totally enlightened. So this is great. I have many therapists and students who are planning to be therapists who listen to these interviews. And so this is great for them to hear. And so I want to ask you about the next phase of that, because you've been a therapist for a long time and you've enjoyed considerable success as well as frustration. I'm glad you shared with us the case that didn't work out. What do you do to nurture yourself and your practice at this stage of the game where you've been doing this work, did you say, for about 40 years?
Mm-hmm.
You could just be at burnout for 40 years of service, but it doesn't feel like that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
How do you keep it alive?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question. And, I think I have to answer it almost in retrospect, because it just came naturally to me. And that is, I've always been so challenged by each case that came in. I've always been searching for what's a new lever, what's a new tool, what's a better way. So I've always been struggling at honing my model. If you think about family therapy, now, family therapy, we all know it's systemic. We all know that are these patterns of interaction. We all family therapists know that, and we know that we've got to help transform a system from being one way to another way. But how do you do that? What do you say? What do you do that are those levers? And I struggled with that deeply for throughout my career, and that's why I ended up writing my book, is because over the many years of honing those my interventions, I realized that I had developed my own mini model. Now, I'm not going to say it's my own model, because it's on the shoulders of the giants. It's on the shoulders of structural family therapy. It's on the shoulders of the Brief Therapy Institute, the Palo Alto Brief Therapy Institute, where they wrote the book Change. Those theoreticians were the foundation for my work. But over time, I had developed my own model, which I called the parent-teen control battle model, parent-child control battle model. And so just by constantly honing my own skills and honing my own thinking and honing my own model and always staying on a learning curve, I've been able to avoid burnout. Yeah. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, I had a family, and I have a fabulous family. My wife is an amazing person, and I really have a deep respect and friendship with my two sons. And I just, we enjoy them tremendously. And I've got very good friends that have been there for us and our kids. And so I just feel like I've had a very rich life, so that I've had a balance to my work life. I've had my family and social life, and a balance to my family and social life. I've had my work life and my career, which has been very rewarding. So, I'd say that's been my blessing right there. Mm-hmm. Now, at this point, I would add, David, that having finally written my book, and now I'm an old guy who's been a therapist now for 40 years. Now I'm in my legacy years. And so now I'm wanting to pass on as much knowledge and insight as I possibly can to both families and therapists. I think our profession has moved too far away from our family therapy roots. I think there's a lot of good work. I'm not going to take it away, say it's bad work, but really good work on CBT and DBT and mindfulness are areas that are exploding, and there's a lot of therapeutic interest in those. And I think they offer enormous benefit to our profession and our clients. But I think when we think about those models and we lose track of every individual we're working with is in a family, They grew up in a family, they're from a family, they're in a family, they're in a context. And if we ignore that context and we don't deal with that, then all these other work pieces out there aren't going to have the impact that they need to have.
Wow. Well, you know, I think that's a great wrap up for our interview. And if you agree, then is there more that you'd like to say?
There is a little bit more I'd like to say if I've got a minute.
Yeah, you do.
I think with on the subject of burnout, which is where we started, um, one thing I really want to encourage therapists to think about and parents to think about, and that is it's okay to ask for help. If you are burning out, it
Mm.
means you need support, you need perspective, and you need downtime, or you need one or more of those things. And if you need that, ask for that. Ask from a neighbor, ask from a friend. We like to help each other. With someone that says, Neil,
Yeah.
could you help me unload my pickup? You asked me. What if I feel grateful that you asked me and that you counted on me to go do something for you? I love it. Neil, could you feed my cat while I'm away overnight? I'd love to. I just think that we feel good when we can help someone else. And if you're a parent and you're struggling, or if you're a therapist and you see a parent that's struggling, let them know that they can ask for help. People love to help each other. You're doing the helper a favor if you ask people for help.
Mhm.
You need it. They want to help. Let's be that way for each other. Let's create a community that's much more there for each other, and let's not be afraid to ask to get our needs met.
Yay. That's a great message for us to wrap up with. And I'm so glad personally to have had this opportunity to be in touch with you again and to get freshly inspired by your model and to have this chance to kind of review it. So, Neil Brown, I want to thank you for being my guest again today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. I can't believe that an hour went by.